Thank you, James. I appreciate that kind introduction. You know, it seems to me they could have just had a global teleconference. They could have saved millions of dollars and millions of gallons of aviation and vehicle fuel. They could have avoided massive carbon dioxide emissions. They could have set a good example. They could have been more honest, ethical, and sustainable, and less hypocritical. But instead, just a few blocks from here, depending on whose press release you're reading, some 5,000 to 20,000 activists, bureaucrats, and politicians have flown in from around the world to stay at fancy hotels and eat fancy food and talk fancy talk about how the rest of humanity must travel, live, work, drive, farm, eat, and electrify our homes, businesses, schools, and hospitals more sustainably, to save the world from supposed resource depletion and man-made climate cataclysms. Among other things, they claim that wind, solar, biofuel, and battery substitutes for fossil fuels are necessary, reliable, clean, green, climate-friendly, renewable, and sustainable. In reality, the claims are baseless and even fraudulent. The substitute technologies they're driving for are environmentally destructive. The UN agenda is eco-imperialistic and worse. The hard reality is that even after 2 decades of mandates and subsidies, the world's total installed wind and solar power still meets only 8% of global electricity demand and only 2% of overall global total energy demand. Biofuels are still mostly wood and cow dung. Fossil fuels still provide over 80% of US and world energy. 20 or more years from now, says global energy consulting firm Wood Mackenzie, the world will still be 80 to 85% dependent on fossil fuels. And from my perspective, thank goodness for that, because the cold, hard bottom line of so-called renewable energy is very simple. The wind and sun may be free, renewable, and sustainable, but the technologies and raw materials required to harness that widely dispersed, intermittent, weather-dependent energy is absolutely not renewable or sustainable or free. For example, U.S. ethanol quotas currently gobble up over 40% of America's corn, grown on cropland the size of Iowa, to displace about 10% of America's gasoline. Corn ethanol also requires billions of gallons of water and vast quantities of pesticides, fertilizers, natural gas, gasoline, and diesel to produce and transport a fuel that drives up food prices, adversely affects food aid and nutrition in poor countries, damages small engines, and gets 1/3 fewer miles per gallon than gasoline. Replacing 100% of U.S. gasoline with ethanol would require some 360 million acres of biotech corn. That's 7 times the land mass of Utah, 4 times the area of Germany. Replacing the entire world's 2018 gasoline consumption, that's only the gasoline consumption, with ethanol would require corn grown on an area the size of India. Substitute canola oil or palm oil for the corn, and we would still need to convert billions of acres of crop, scenic, and wildlife habitat land, including orangutan habitat in Indonesia, into biofuel plantations. Eliminating fossil fuels means we'd also have to replace the oil and natural gas feedstocks that we use and need for pharmaceuticals, wind turbine blades, solar panel films, paints, synthetic fibers, fertilizers, and plastics for cell phones, computers, eyeglasses, car bodies, and countless other products. So now we're talking about maybe twice the land area of India turned into biofuel plantations. How much land would that leave us for food crops, wildlife, and scenery? How much water, fertilizer, pesticides, and energy would all of that require? And how is any of that possibly renewable and sustainable? And then to top it off, of course, burning those biofuels would still release climate-destroying carbon dioxide. Then there's the Drax power plant in UK, in England. My favorite example of biofuels, sustainable biofuels insanity. Every year, American and Canadian companies cut down thousands of acres of forest habitats and turn millions of trees into wood pellets. They then truck the pellets to coastal ports and transport them on oil fuel cargo ships to England. There, the pellets are hauled by train to the Drax power plant and burned in place of coal to generate electricity so that the UK can meet its renewable fuel targets, supposedly. And to top it off, the pellets cost more than coal, which Britain still has in great abundance. So utility companies receive millions of dollars every year in subsidies, which sends electricity prices even higher for British homes, families, factories, businesses, and hospitals. And of course, when these wood pellets are burned, they also generate climate-wrecking carbon dioxide, more CO2, in fact, than coal or gas plants would on a total life cycle basis. Solar panels on Nevada's Nellis Air Force Base generate a minuscule 15 megawatts of electricity, about 40% of the year, from 140 acres. Arizona's Palo Verde nuclear power plant generates 760 times more electricity from less land, some 95% of the time. Howard was talking about California shutting down some of its nuclear power plants. Well, they're shutting down the power plants, but they still want the power, so a lot of this electricity from Palo Verde over in the Phoenix area of Arizona goes to California. And generating Palo Verde's electricity output using Nellis technology would require land area 10 times larger than Washington, D.C., and the solar panels would still provide electricity only unpredictably and sporadically, only 1/3 of the year, even in excellent solar locations like Arizona and Nevada. So maybe those conference people attending the UN program down the road here could calculate the solar panels and acreage that would be required to generate the 3.5 billion megawatt hours that Americans consumed nationwide in 2018 and explain to us how that would be sustainable and renewable. I think it'd be a great homework assignment for them. Mandated subsidized wind energy requires millions of acres for turbines and ultra-long transmission lines and billions of tons of concrete, steel, copper, rare earth metals, and fiberglass. The turbines provide intermittent, unreliable electricity that costs much more than coal or gas-fueled electricity once the subsidies are pulled out, and must be backed up by fossil fuel generators that have to go from standby to full power many times a day, very inefficiently every time the wind stops blowing. They kill numerous raptors, other birds, and bats every year. Their light flicker and subsonic noise impair human health. Modern coal and gas-fired power plants generate, say, 600 megawatts, some 95% of the time, from a land area that's less than 300 acres. Indiana's Fowler Ridge wind farm also generates 600 megawatts from 350 turbines, but it only does so about 30% of the time every year, and it covers 50,000 acres. Now suppose the entire world is going to use wind power to replace the more than 25 billion megawatt hours of electricity it consumed in 2018. That's electricity only. It's not including worldwide fossil fuel consumption like coal for factories and fuels for vehicles. Let's also assume we're going to generate enough extra electricity, as Howard was discussing a few minutes ago, every windy day to charge batteries to provide non-fossil fuel backup electrical power for just 7 straight windless days. Now, it's clearly going to take a lot of wind turbines, especially as we're forced to go into lower and lower quality wind turbine wind locations. That means instead of generating full nameplate power, maybe 33% of the time on average, those wind turbines will ultimately only do so about 16% of the time. So how many turbines are we talking about? The world would need some 100 million wind turbines, each one 400 feet tall, each one capable of generating 1.8 megawatts at full capacity when the wind is blowing at the proper speed. Now, assuming just a meager 15 acres apiece, those monster turbines would require some 1.5 billion acres. That's 80% of the entire lower 48 United States, without including the big transmission lines. And that gauntlet of whirling blades would wipe out raptors, other birds, and bats across vast areas of land worldwide. Manufacturing all those wind turbines would require something on the order of 30 billion tons of steel, copper, and alloys for the towers and turbines, 55 billion tons of steel and concrete for the foundations, 10 million tons of neodymium for turbine magnets, 5 billion tons of complex composite petroleum-based or biofuel-based materials for the nacelle covers and the turbine blades, and massive quantities of rock and gravel for millions of miles of access roads to the turbines. That picture there shows, by the way, wind turbines in West Virginia. I flew right over that wind turbine site on the mountaintops where they've cleared the mountaintops on my way here from Virginia. And all those materials must be mined and smelted and processed and manufactured into finished products and shipped all over the world. Extracting them would require removing trillions of tons of overburdened earth and rock and crushing tens of billions of tons of ore. Building those ultra-long, high-voltage transmission lines would require still more raw materials and more millions of acres. That entire process would also require massive amounts of fossil fuels, because wind turbines and solar panels cannot operate earth-moving and mining equipment or produce consistently high enough heat to melt silica, iron, copper, rare earth, and other materials. The wind turbine's intermittent, unreliable, unpredictable, weather-dependent electricity output means cement kilns and smelters, foundries, refineries, and factories would basically be inoperable. In fact, it's virtually impossible for wind turbines and solar panels even to generate enough energy over their operational lifetimes just to process the metals, make the concrete, and run the factories to manufacture just the wind turbines and solar panels and transmission lines, much less power civilization. Science journalist, businessman, and parliamentarian Matt Ridley estimates wind turbines need some 200 times more raw materials per megawatt hour than modern combined cycle gas turbines. He points out that world energy demand has been growing at over 2% a year for nearly 40 years. So, if global energy demand keeps growing at just under 2,000 terawatt hours every year and 2 megawatt wind turbines were to supply all of that growth, Ridley calculates that the world would have to build and install 350,000 new 2 megawatt turbines every single year. That's 1.5 times more than have been built worldwide in the last 20 plus years. In 50 years, we would need 17 million new turbines just to meet new energy demand, not to replace the massive energy we already get from fossil fuels, which, as I said, supply over 80% of U.S. and global energy needs. Using his data, Ridley says 50 acres per turbine for 2 megawatt turbines and access roads. In 50 years, we would need to cover a land area the size of Russia. Again, just to meet new energy demand globally. So add in the steel, concrete, fiberglass, rare earth metals, copper, and other materials we would need for that. And remember, these numbers do not include the cement, steel, copper, and other materials for the ultra-long transmission lines that would be required to carry electricity from windy locations to cities, most of which would be hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles from the big wind turbine industrial sites. Remember, too, Billions of people around the world still do not enjoy the incredible blessings, the jobs, health, nutrition, living standards, and longevity that come from having electricity, cars, tractors, refrigerators, airplanes, and other technologies that we in the industrialized world almost take for granted. Those billions of people are not going to let anyone, including the pampered people up the road from here, tell them they can never enjoy those blessings. They are not going to let anyone tell them they will be allowed to improve their health and living standards only a little bit, only at the margins, only to the extent that it can be supported by pseudo-renewable, pseudo-sustainable wind, solar, and cow dung power. That's another reason why energy demand is going to continue growing by at least 2% a year, and why that demand is going to be met primarily by fossil fuel, hydro, and nuclear power, and not by wind, solar, and biofuel energy. Energy analyst Robert Bryce puts it this way: just since 2014, the barrels of oil equivalent increase in production from the Permian Basin alone is equal to 3 times the actual total annual output of all the wind turbines that were ever installed and still remain operational in the United States. It's 9 times the actual total annual output from all U.S. photovoltaic solar panels. Most renewable energy advocates detest fossil fuels, and they promote battery power backup for intermittent, weather-dependent industrial wind and solar facilities that they insist we have to install. They want to replace the coal and gas backup power plants that we now rely on so that our electricity-based homes, offices, hospitals, factories, and civilization don't shut down for hours or days on end every time the wind and sun stop cooperating. Without fossil fuels, ensuring predictable electricity for lights, smelters, assembly lines, the internet, Facebook, hospitals, refrigerators, stoves, and 1,000 other technologies would require that we store the excess wind and solar energy we harness during good wind and solar days into massive battery arrays. So how many batteries? To have enough power to convert current levels of global electricity consumption for just 7 windless days, the world would need something on the order of 5 billion 100 kilowatt hour, 1,000 pound lithium and cobalt based battery packs, the kind that Tesla uses in its electric cars. So maybe the nice folks up the road from here can calculate the land, energy, and raw materials that would be required to manufacture and install all those batteries. But in the process, they need to add in the raw material requirements for the batteries we would need to replace all the world's cars and trucks and buses with electric vehicles and recharge those vehicles every few hours. And then they also have to factor in the fact that those batteries and wind turbines and solar panels would have to be replaced every 5, 10, or maybe 15 years. In fact, says energy analyst Mark Mills, realizing the UN environmentalist dream of a centrally managed green new world powered by wind, solar, biofuel, and battery power would require the biggest single expansion in mining the world has ever seen. But when was the last time any of those UN conference attendees supported opening or expanding a single mine? Maybe they expect minerals manna from heaven, or finished metals that are just beamed down from the Starship Enterprise. And don't forget the trash. What do we do with all those broken down turbines and panels and batteries? According to Mills and the International Renewable Energy Agency, disposing just the worn-out solar panels erected by 2050 under the Paris Climate Treaty's solar energy goals would result in 2 times the tonnage of the world's total plastic waste in 2018. But hey, at least they're out there banning plastic straws. So I ask, are these UN people simply incapable of seeing the chasm between their flowery sustainability rhetoric and their anti-mining, anti-fossil fuel attitudes? Or are they just lying, power-hungry tyrants? Or are they both? I don't know. The verdict is still out. And that brings me to the dirtiest pseudo-renewable, pseudo-sustainable energy secret of all. The one the folks up the road from here and in Greenpeace, UN, and Green New Energy Deal offices simply don't want to talk about: slave and child labor. Thanks largely to rabid environmentalist opposition, the United States and Europe no longer permit much mining within their borders. And the same groups that extol the virtues of wind, solar, and battery power are equally opposed to Western mining companies extracting rare earth, lithium, cadmium, cobalt, and other minerals almost anywhere on planet Earth, even under rigorous Western labor safety, environmental, and reclamation rules. So that means those materials get mined and processed in places like Baotou, Inner Mongolia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, mostly under Chinese control these days. They are dug out and processed by fathers, mothers, and children, often under horrific, unsafe, inhuman conditions that few of us can even imagine, and under labor, wage, health, and safety standards that even 19th century robber barons probably wouldn't have tolerated. Those renewable energy, high-tech slaves get a few pennies or dollars a day while risking cave-ins and being exposed constantly, 24/7, to filthy, toxic, radioactive mud, dust, water, and air. The mining and industrial areas become vast toxic wastelands where nothing grows and no people or wildlife can live. For cobalt alone, according to UNICEF and Amnesty International, over 40,000 Congolese children, as young as 4 years old, slave away in mines from sunrise to sundown, 6 or even 7 days a week. People like the 5,000 or 20,000 folks gathered nearby demand perfection from Western mining companies and zero mining in the West. But they don't seem to give a spotted owl hoot about any of this. If we had a show of hands, I would bet virtually every one of them would support and demand sustainable, ethical, human rights-based coffee, sneakers, t-shirts, handbags, and diamonds. Absolutely no child labor, sweatshop, or toxic, polluted workplace conditions would be tolerated. I'd also bet those same people and their legions of Greenpeace and Green New Deal followers would have little or nothing to say about the Chinese, Russian, and other companies that run the horrid operations that provide their wind turbines, solar panels, smart grids, and batteries for their cell phones, laptops, Teslas, and backup battery electrical power. Why do I say that? Because I've never seen them make ethical wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries an issue. I've never seen them stage protests outside a Russian or Chinese or Congolese embassy, much less outside corporate headquarters in Beijing, Moscow, or Kinshasa. They probably just don't want to get shot or sent off to gulags. The other reason I say that is because just a few weeks ago, California legislators voted down Assembly Bill 735. That bill simply said the virtuous state of California would certify that all of its zero-emission or electric vehicles sold in the state would be free of any materials or components that involve child labor. Simple, practical, moral, ethical. Well, the issue is complicated, the legislators said. It would be too hard to enforce. It would imperil state climate goals. And besides, lots of other industries also use child labor, so the legislators explained, without naming any such companies. The bottom line here is simple. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Wind, solar, biofuel, and battery power are not free, clean, green, renewable, or sustainable. The world cannot afford to let Delusion, dishonesty, and ideology drive public policies that will determine our future jobs, prosperity, living conditions, and civilization. What the official UN conference is talking about a few blocks from here has nothing to do with real sustainability, resource conservation, or recycling. It has everything to do with self-righteous virtue signaling, power-hungry, taxpayer-financed, largely illiterate activists, politicians, regulators, and crony capitalists imposing their views, controlling people's lives, dictating energy use, economic growth, and living standards, and getting richer and more powerful and more privileged in the process. But meanwhile, the rest of us, especially poor minority and working class citizens, pay the price. And the world's most destitute families pay the highest price. Those policies are unjust, inhumane, and eco-imperialistic and lethal. They can no longer be tolerated. And in fact, I'll go a step further, and I don't say this lightly or casually. The climate change sustainability agenda that is being advanced by these activists and bureaucrats is eco-fascist, totalitarian, and racist. It seeks to impose an economic system under which a centralized planetary government does not own companies outright, but it sure does dictate what they can and cannot do, down to the smallest details. That's the definition of a fascist economic system. It's also based on big, constantly repeated lies about dangerous man-made climate change, sustainability, and renewable energy. All those are hallmarks of fascist economics. And in fact, it's becoming a thought control police state that allows no discussion or dissent. And it imposes its horrific, dehumanizing, lethal impacts most heavily on people of color. The poorest, most deprived, most politically powerless, most destitute families on earth. I think it's high time we had serious, honest, robust, evidence-based debates on all of this, with all interested and all affected parties participating, including the world's poor and man-made climate chaos skeptics like us. The folks up the road from here need to open their UN, IPCC, and World Bank confabs to people with different viewpoints, information, concerns, and objectives. They need to engage us in respectful discourse and approach these critical life and death decisions thoughtfully, not tangentiously, democratically, not dictatorially. Along with Google, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Spotify, Wikipedia, universities, and so-called mainstream media, these would-be global rulers need to end their efforts to censor, marginalize, ostracize, disinvite, shadow ban, electronic book burn, and algorithm eradicate differing alternative contrarian evidence and perspectives on where we are and where we ought to be heading. If they cannot or will not do that, these taxpayer-funded global governmental institutions should be defunded, disbanded, and stripped of their power and influence. The world paid a massive human, environmental, and civilizational price for fascist communist dictatorships in the 20th century. We cannot afford to repeat those tragic calamities. Thank you.